Hello, my friends. On Saturday, the 16th of May, in the year 2026, the city that gave the modern world habeas corpus, the Glorious Revolution, the abolition of the slave trade, and the principle that no man may be detained without due process, was divided in two. From Exhibition Road in South Kensington, a column of perhaps 30,000 marched east under Palestinian flags, commemorating the 78th anniversary of what its participants call the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. From Kingsway, half a mile to the northeast, a column of perhaps 50,000 marched south under Union Jacks and the red and white crosses of St. George, billed by its organisers as a defence of British speech and British sovereignty. 4,000 police officers, drawn from forces well beyond the capital, stood between them. Drones circled. Live facial recognition cameras, deployed for the first time in a public order operation of this scale, scanned the crowds. Mounted officers held the cordons. The FA Cup final, that great fixture of the English sporting calendar, kicked off at Wembley in North London with the city's police force occupied elsewhere. Anyone watching the coverage that afternoon could be forgiven for concluding that the centre of the British state had become, for a few hours, the stage on which two halves of a national argument had agreed to act out their incompatibility in public. That is not an inaccurate description. It is, however, an incomplete one. The deeper question raised by the events of that Saturday is not which side was right. It is what the day tells us about a country in which the only remaining way to be heard by either of these constituencies is to assemble in such numbers on such streets that the apparatus of the state is obliged to deploy against them the technological tools of a surveillance society, and in which, even then, the principal national broadcasters appear to find it easier to describe the marchers as weather than to ask any of them a question. Before turning to the substance of what each march represented, it is worth pausing on a conversation I had earlier this week with Dr. Edward Crampton, a historian of British political demonstrations who has written for some years on the question of why mass public assembly has returned, after a long interval, as a central feature of British politics. The exchange was conducted in his college study in Oxford, over rather strong tea, and ranged more widely than the extracts below suggest. But the substance was contained in the following exchanges, which I reproduce here because they frame what follows. Hi, Edward. You've spent much of your career studying mass demonstrations in Britain, Chartism, the suffragettes, the great anti-Iraq war march of 2003. When you look at what's happening this Saturday in London, what kind of moment do you think we're in?
I think we're in a moment that historians 50 years from now will treat as a turning point, though it won't be a single date. It will be a band of years, and call it 2023 to 2027, in which the British public rediscovered that the streets are still available to them. That sounds banal, but it isn't. For most of my professional life, mass demonstration in Britain was a thing of the past. The great anti-Iraq protest of 2003 was treated, even at the time, as a kind of echo. Politics had moved into committee rooms, into focus groups, into broadcast studios. The crowd had been retired, and now the crowd is back, on both sides.
Why now, do you think?
The honest answer is that there are several reasons, and they combine. The simplest is that two extraordinary developments, the war in Gaza after October 2023 and the cumulative effect of 2 decades of historically high migration into Britain, have produced constituencies who feel, with some reason, that the ordinary political machinery is not addressing what they are actually concerned about. The pro-Palestinian constituency feels that no British government of either party will impose the consequences on the Israeli government that they believe a humane policy would require. The constituency marching today behind the Union Jack feels that no British government of either party will impose the consequences on illegal channel crossings that they believe a coherent border policy would require. Both feel, from their respective vantage points, ignored by their political class. And when people feel ignored long enough, they march. This is not a new pattern in British history. It is the oldest one.
Critics will say the comparison is improper, that one march is a humanitarian cause and the other is a far-right mobilization. How do you respond?
I respond by saying that the labels are doing a great deal of work in that sentence and that one should examine what the work actually is. There are humanitarian people on the Palestinian march, and there are people on the Palestinian march whose placards and chants would not survive scrutiny in a magistrate's court. We know this because the Metropolitan Police has, for 2 years now, been making arrests at these events for inciting hatred and supporting proscribed organisations. There are sincere patriots on the Robinson March, and there are people on that march whose conduct has earned the attention of the criminal justice system. The honest description of both crowds is that each contains a wide spectrum. The dishonest description of either is that it is a monolith. The labels, like humanitarian, far-right, are tools for ending discussion, not tools for understanding it. They tell you whom you are permitted to support and whom you are required to denounce. They are not, in any analytical sense, descriptions.
And the Metropolitan Police's decision to deploy live facial recognition technology in a public order operation of this kind for the first time, what do you make of that?
I make of it what any historically literate observer should make of it. The state has decided that the technological infrastructure originally justified by reference to terrorism is now an appropriate tool for managing the lawful political expression of its own citizens. I do not think anyone protesting today on either side would be reassured if they understood the implications fully. The cameras do not, of course, distinguish between left and right. They simply remember every face that passes them. The historical name for a polity that catalogues the political assemblies of its citizens is not one anyone wishes to apply to a modern democracy. But the description has, at minimum, become a fair question to ask. And it is curious how little it has been asked, even by the broadcasters who would normally regard themselves as guardians of civil liberty.
One final question. If you had to identify the single thing the political class has most badly misjudged about this whole period, what would it be?
The assumption that contempt is a substitute for argument. For roughly a decade, the response of mainstream British politics to citizens raising what were, in the end, fairly serious questions about the pace and scale of demographic change and about the cultural consequences flowing from that change was to call them names. Bigot, far-right, gammon, whatever the term of art was that season. The questions did not go away. The questioners did not go away. They simply stopped accepting that the names were a real answer. What you are watching on the streets today is, in part, what happens when an entire political class spends 10 years answering serious questions with insults, and then discovers that the insults have stopped working. The same point, in mirror image, applies to the response to legitimate concerns about Gaza. Telling people who are watching a war on their phones every night that their concern is morally suspect produces in time a crowd of 30,000 who no longer accept the framing.
Let us be precise about what occurred. The Nakba 78 march, organised principally by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in coalition with Stop the War, the Friends of Al-Aqsa and the Palestinian Forum in Britain, assembled at noon on Exhibition Road in South Kensington. Its applied for route would have taken it to Trafalgar Square. The Metropolitan Police, citing the simultaneous Unite the Kingdom march and the practical difficulty of managing two large bodies of opposed marchers converging on the same square, denied the application and rerouted the Palestinian march to terminate at Pall Mall instead. The organisers protested this decision with considerable energy, describing it variously as a symbolic relegation, a capitulation to the far right, and an indication that the Met was operating under political pressure from the government. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign's deputy director, Peter Leary, told The National that he regarded the routing as disgraceful. Prominent actors, including Khalid Abdallah and Juliet Stevenson, signed a letter to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police protesting the decision. The Unite the Kingdom March, organised by the activist who operates under the name Tommy Robinson, his given name being Stephen Yaxley Lennon, was the successor to the rally of September 2025. Which had drawn between 110,000 and 150,000 people, according to the Metropolitan Police's own estimates, and at which 23 participants had been arrested following clashes with police. The 16 May rally assembled at Kingsway and proceeded south toward Trafalgar Square. Its slogans were predominantly against illegal migration, against what its participants described as two-tier policing, and in defence of free speech. A great many Union Jacks were carried, a great many St. George's crosses. A smaller number of American and Israeli flags appeared at the margins, as they had in September. 11 arrests had been made by midday across both events, according to the Met. 2 were of men sought in connection with a vehicle ramming incident in Birmingham, who had attempted to join the Unite the Kingdom march. 1 was of a woman at the Nakba demonstration who declined to remove her face covering when asked. The 8 others were spread across both rallies for offences ranging from breach of conditions to suspicion of inciting hatred. Earlier in the day, reporters from GB News had been refused interviews by several marchers at the Nakba demonstration, with one declining on the simple grounds of "we don't deal with you." A separate group at the Unite the Kingdom march had spoken at length to a different reporter, expressing what may fairly be summarised as a settled frustration with the political class and a determination not to be told any longer that their views were illegitimate. Both responses in their way were data, a brief observation since it bears on what follows. GB News, the broadcaster whose footage from both marches has now been widely circulated on social media, styles itself the People's Channel. The phrase has been mocked, including by serious commentators, as the marketing language of a populist broadcaster pursuing a particular demographic. There is some justice in the mockery, but there is also something worth registering in the fact that no other major British broadcaster appears to have considered the simple act of asking ordinary marchers on camera and at length why they were there. The BBC sent crews, ITN sent crews, Sky sent crews. Their coverage was, on the whole, competent, professional, and conducted at a respectable distance from the marchers themselves. The reporters spoke to organisers, to police commanders, to politicians, to one another. The men and women on the streets, in their hundreds of thousands across the year, appeared chiefly as a kind of weather, a phenomenon to be described from a studio rather than a population to be interviewed. This is not in itself a scandal. Broadcasters make editorial choices, and one cannot interview everyone. But the cumulative effect of those choices over several years has been curious. The marches grow larger, the questions raised by the marchers become more pointed, and the mainstream coverage continues by and large to describe the marchers in terms drawn from the language of public order, tensions, disruption, community concerns. The marchers themselves, as individuals with reasons, with biographies, with grievances articulable in plain English, appear less often than they might. Into that vacuum the populist broadcasters have moved, They have done so with varying degrees of professionalism. But they have done so because no one else was going to. To complain about the result is to complain about a market responding to an unmet demand. There is a difficulty that must be addressed directly, because it is the difficulty that distinguishes the present argument from a partisan one. The pro-Palestinian movement in Britain has, since the autumn of 2023, produced demonstrations of a scale unprecedented since the Iraq War. The vast majority of those who have attended these demonstrations have done so out of genuine, often anguished concern at the scale of civilian death in Gaza. That concern is legitimate. It is reasonable. It is shared in varying degrees by serious people across the political spectrum, including a significant number of British Jews who have themselves marched under the Palestinian banner. To attribute to that majority the views of the worst placards is the same error as attributing to the majority on the other march the views of those whose conduct has placed them in handcuffs. Both errors are common. Both are wrong. That said, the Metropolitan Police has been quite clear about what has in fact been arrested for at these marches. People have been arrested for calling in chants for the globalization of the Intifada. Following Sir Keir Starmer's call on the 30th of April for the prosecution of those who use that phrase in a public order context, the policing of such chants has, by the Met's own statement, become more assertive. People have been arrested for displaying placards endorsing Hamas, a proscribed organization under British law. People have been arrested at past Nakba and Palestinian marches for displaying material the courts have judged anti-Semitic. On the 16th of May, the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, James Harman, had stated in advance that officers would be committed to taking a more assertive approach to chanting and the displaying of phrases on placards or banners that incite hatred. On the other side, the Unite the Kingdom rally in September 2025 produced documented instances of anti-Muslim chanting, assaults on counter-protesters, and 23 arrests, including for violent disorder. 26 police officers were injured in that earlier rally, 4 seriously. The Home Secretary at the time condemned those who have attacked and injured police officers. These are not contested facts. They are the official record. The point of rehearsing both lists is not to draw a moral equivalence. It is to insist that the two marches must each be assessed on their actual contents, not on the rhetorical framing preferred by their respective opponents. A movement that produces, with regularity, individual participants whose conduct breaches British law is one that has an internal problem worth examining, whether it is the Palestinian movement or the nationalist one. The fact that both movements have this problem in different forms and to different extents does not make either innocent. It makes the problem more general than either side's partisans wish to admit. Beneath the immediate question of who marched and what they shouted, there sits a deeper question that British politics has spent the last decade evading. It is the question of whether the country still possesses, in any meaningful sense, a common public square in which serious disagreements can be conducted without being routed through the streets. The honest answer, on the present evidence, is that it does not. Parliament has long since ceased to function as such a square. Its debates are conducted increasingly for the benefit of television clips destined for partisan consumption. The press, fragmented and increasingly aligned with particular constituencies, no longer constitutes a shared forum. The universities, once a venue for at least some kinds of mixed discussion, have in many cases become institutional spaces in which heterodox views are conducted carefully or not at all. In the absence of such a square, what remains? What remains is the street. The pro-Palestinian constituency takes to the street because it does not believe its concerns will be heard otherwise, and it has accumulated over 2.5 years considerable empirical support for that belief. The nationalist constituency takes to the street for the same reason and from the same conviction. Both are correct that the political class has not, on the whole, taken their concerns sufficiently seriously. Both are wrong, however, in supposing that their concerns are unique. The condition they describe, of being unheard, is not the special property of either side. It is the present condition of the British political settlement itself, in which a great many citizens of widely differing views have concluded that their actual opinions are not represented by the people who govern in their name. There is, one might add, a particular irony to the fact that the two crowds spent the day separated by 4,000 police officers and a phalanx of facial recognition cameras. The two crowds have, in some respects, more in common with one another than either has with the political class watching them from a safe distance. Both are composed, in their majorities, of people who feel that the country has changed under them in ways they were not consulted about. Both are composed of people who feel that the official channels of complaint have been closed to them. Both contain a minority whose conduct is genuinely indefensible, and both contain a majority who have come to the streets because they could not think of anywhere else to go. There is one further point that requires making before we close. It concerns the simple act of listening and what has happened to it in British public discourse. A generation ago, the conventional understanding of journalism in a free society was that, faced with a large crowd of citizens assembled in public on a question of national importance, a reporter's first duty was to find out, by direct inquiry, why those citizens were there. The question was elementary. The answers were various. From the variety, a picture could be constructed. The picture might confirm what the reporter had supposed, or it might not. Either way, the answers were the data and the picture followed from them, not the other way round. Something has happened to this assumption. On the day of the marches just described, the reporter who tried to interview Palestinian marchers was, in several instances, refused on the grounds that her channel was the wrong channel. This is not a complaint against the marchers, whose right to decline an interview is unimpeachable. It is a complaint against the cultural condition that produced the refusal, a condition in which large sections of the political public have come to regard the act of being asked their views by an outlet they disapprove of as a form of attack, and the act of declining to answer as a form of dignity. One sees the mirror image of this on the other march. Both crowds have learned from long experience that the available broadcasters are either friendly to them or hostile to them, and that there is no shared journalistic forum in which they will be treated simply as citizens with reasons. The consequence is a country in which two large constituencies, marching for two opposed causes, share at least one conviction, that the act of being interviewed by the wrong outlet is more dangerous to them than the act of not being heard at all. It is hard to overstate how unhealthy this condition is. A democracy in which citizens cannot be asked their views by the mainstream press because they have concluded that the mainstream press is not interested in hearing them honestly is a democracy in which the basic information flow on which self-government depends has broken down. The cure is not, on the available evidence, to be found in the political class scolding the citizens for their distrust. It is to be found, if it is to be found at all, in journalistic institutions willing to make the difficult and unfashionable effort of asking ordinary marchers on both sides what they actually think, and then printing or broadcasting the answers without the editorial scaffolding that has come to substitute in much current coverage for the answers themselves. This is not a fashionable suggestion. It would require certain editors to acknowledge that their long-running characterizations of certain crowds have been, at best, incomplete. It would require admitting that constituencies one has spent some years dismissing have, in fact, reasons that deserve a hearing on their own terms. It would require, in short, the very thing the political class has resisted most strenuously for the last decade, the discipline of treating citizens one disagrees with as citizens rather than as problems. That discipline is, in the end, the discipline on which any functioning liberal society depends. It is also the discipline most conspicuously absent from the British public conversation on the questions that brought 80,000 people to the streets on Saturday. By the time these words are read, the reports of the day will have settled into a familiar shape. The broadsheet press will lead with the police operation. The tabloids will lead with whichever side produced the most striking placard. The political class will issue statements regretting any criminal conduct on both sides while taking care not to engage with any of the substantive concerns of either. By Monday, the news cycle will have moved on. The marchers will have returned home to Wigan and Bromley and Birmingham and Glasgow, to Hackney and Tower Hamlets and Bradford. The cameras will have been folded up. The questions, however, will not have been answered. The questions, indeed, will not have been asked except by a handful of broadcasters whom the mainstream class will continue to dismiss as populist. That dismissal will continue to be a strategic error for the simple reason that the questions are not going away and that the broadcasters in question are the only ones currently asking them. A society that wishes to discourage the rise of populist media has one straightforward path available to it. Take seriously in its mainstream media the questions that the populist media takes seriously and answer those questions on serious terms. A society that does not wish to do this should not be surprised when the populist media grows. This is not a complicated dynamic. It has been visible to anyone willing to look for some years now. As to the marches themselves, the most striking thing about them was not what was said on the platforms, or what was carried on the placards, or even what was arrested for at the cordons. The most striking thing was the number of people present. 80,000 citizens of one country, give or take, chose to spend a Saturday afternoon on the streets of its capital in two opposed columns because they could not think of a better way to make themselves heard. That fact on its own is the indictment. It is an indictment of every political institution that has, over the last decade, found its citizens easier to mock than to engage. The mockery has not produced the silence the mockers expected. It has produced the streets. There is a final observation, and it is one that the comfortable observer from a Westminster wine bar will not wish to hear, but that the historian of British politics half a century from now will record without hesitation. Mass demonstrations of this scale, conducted on this frequency on these subjects, do not occur in healthy democracies. They occur when something has gone wrong, and when ordinary citizens have concluded that ordinary remedies have ceased to work. That something has not yet been named in any official forum. It has, however, been very plainly noticed by the 80,000 who, between them, walked through central London on the afternoon of the 16th of May. Whether the political class chooses to notice in turn, chooses, that is, to credit the marchers with the dignity of having reasons rather than the indignity of having labels, remains to be seen. The evidence of the last decade suggests caution. The evidence of the last decade also suggests that the streets, having found their voice again, are unlikely to surrender it merely because the mockery becomes louder. They have, after all, walked through it before.